Good evening, everyone. Once again, this is Rillian on mic for Team 2MK. We are having one of our Kame House lobbies for Dragon Ball Fighters. Effectively a beginner lobby. Loser stays on. We are in US East Coast 2. Ring match priority lobby 02. And you're looking for a red hit standing outside of Kame House itself if you want to start a ring match. The passcode is in the stream title. Feel free to join in whenever you wish. It's been a while since the game got a strong opinion on the tiers. But today we're going to be talking about what the general understood situation was before. The conventional wisdom before was that the top tier characters in the game, or at least the top tier team, was either Sonic Fox's or Goichi's. The concept of which characters were relevant, either as assists or in general flow, differed between the East and West for a bit. So we, of course, focused on the character that mostly everyone assumed and agreed on was good, Adult Gohan. Our last two streams, therefore, have had a lot of conceptual mid-level play concepts of how to deal with Adult Gohan, which is useful because at least 3 of our team play this character, all with different goals. Currently, discussion has a lot more to do with whether or not Goku Black is still good, is dangerous in neutral, has a place in most teams, etc. And whether or not Vegeta is objectively the best assist in the game. The top level players all have their general personal ways of playing that may also influence whether or not the character is good for them, rather than the basic concept of tiers, which is a separate thing. So, what you're facing in online play, and what I've seen the most complaints about, is the team of Cell, Vegeta, and Android 16, with varying replacements of Adult Gohan in there. We're going to see a lot more of that covered in the latter half of the stream, but not at that exact team. Because in order to understand why a team is particularly strong, you need to be able to look at the components when you shift one part of them. There may be an entire cohesive strategy that is strong, and not so much a specific team in itself. Obviously, there is the team that is absolutely best at achieving that strategy. But you may find that other people may be able to play a relatively top-tier strategy with entirely different characters. It has generally been accepted though that the only assist that does what Vegeta does as an assist is Vegeta. And this has been meaning less and less as people became consistently more able to deal with the Vegeta assist, developing defensive options against it. It may be that this turns out to not be all that threatening once most of the high-level players have figured out what they want to do about it. In order to understand why any given strategy is good or bad, you have to work out what exactly it is that any strategy is trying to do relative to the game plans. Why would a strategy be particularly good? The general concept at the moment is that having a strong character to play neutral with, a strong character to assist and put on pressure when neutral has ended and you've managed to get some advantage, and finally, a character for mix-ups and big damage is the way to solve most of your problems. So, in both our teams here, we have a setup like that, even if only a little bit. It's generally accepted that the neutral game of Goku Black is relatively good. It's still under debate as to whether or not it's the best, but it's definitely good enough that you could know it and take it. Goku similarly can play nearly any position, and therefore whether or not you use him for that or something else has a lot more to do with meter usage and where you are in the setups. And finally, of course, Adult Gohan can do the job of being pressury, if you have the execution for that. The easiest way to tell whether or not a character is actually top tier or not is whether or not the way that they do it is just easy to do or if it's actually hard to counter by the nature of the game. Being able to put a lot of pressure on your opponent without thinking too hard often makes people feel as if a character is stronger than they are. This is true at the release of pretty much any new game. And this game has only really been going since the end of January. Now that is quite some time, but it's still functionally only 10 weeks in.
Brace yourself for the coming battle!
What you generally want to get out of your characters, therefore, should not just be the easiest method, because people will eventually figure it out, and the higher you get, the more likely you are to find someone who will. In many games, the character most capable of dishing out damage or making the opponent panic has the highest chance of being successful, because a panicky opponent is often a dead opponent. It is why one of the first things you can train in any of these games is blocking. Block as long as you can. Whenever you feel yourself stressed out by a new character, just block everything. Once neutral reappears, you can certainly try to play some neutral, but the moment you find yourself at a disadvantage, just block. Because it is so easy to get the idea that an opponent's character is strong based on the fact that they keep on opening you up, but they open you up because you keep moving. So the first thing to train yourself to do against top tier characters in any game is stop trying to take initiative from them. There's a high chance that the character is considered top tier because it's so hard to win when you try to get initiative back. Any character actually can feel fairly top tier if you don't ever manage to block anything they're doing. This is generally why it almost always feels as if grapplers are strong in nearly all 2D fighting games. They violate the primary aspect of the game. We are taught that blocking is how we deal with top tier characters, and then these top tier characters grab us and solve the problem that way. Top tier zoners require a ton of patience, top tier grapplers require a lot of movement and awareness, and top tier pressure characters require you to block. The reason Adult Gohan is so incredibly scary is because, under most circumstances, he and Kid Buu get to just keep on attacking for as long as they have meter. So it will always feel as if they're top tier, because if you never have any opportunity to stop them, obviously the character will seem as if it's better than yours. So, basing on that, we're going to look at what makes characters feel top tier in matches today, and ways that damage gets taken. We know, for example, that our Kid Buu team gets to basically stay in the air and keep attacking indefinitely.
Get ready!
Understanding your options in neutral against rushdown style characters is also very important because of this. But you can actually see that it's not all that easy for Buu to open you up without meter. The damage he does while trying to is generally quite small. And once you've reached a certain space on the screen, most characters have an extremely powerful stand heavy. Characters who are good at playing neutral are particularly good at this. What is difficult for most of us is getting ourselves to not react to motion by trying to hit a powerful move. That is the first instinct most people have in fighting games. A big move has been done, it is now my turn, let me hit a powerful move of my own. And indeed, a lot of people can play entire fighting games like that and think that that's how fighting games work as a generality. Even when you know better, it can be really hard to stop yourself from doing this. This is particularly bad for people who play characters in games like this whose neutral options and regular buttons are actually really strong. Because those people end up suffering based on trying to do too many moves when they already had better options, just hit buttons. It's effectively big number syndrome in the fighting game arena. But one good example is that Goku Black Stand Heavy is actually basically safe. It's a terrifying neutral move. And whenever it lands, you actually get to do a full combo. You can just bounce them off the wall or whatever. His crouch heavy is even better. You basically can't attack the character by coming in from the air if he's ready for you at all. You can just anti-air everything all of the time. But because he is a very powerful looking character with very powerful moves, you are very likely to try to use his moves. If we take the principle of how to learn fighting games, specifically by trying to do one or two simple things, the problem arises when the one or two simple things we want to do are not the best options for the character. Because obviously you should learn your character's best options first as soon as you can.
The battle's about to start. Good luck.
One good example is that Piccolo's homing projectiles give the impression that they should be useful, one of the larger parts of his game plan. But for most people, they're really not. They are a very good tool in certain situations for setting up your opponent to want to respond, but they're not that good for base game plan. This is not the first thing you learn on Piccolo. Similarly, the first thing to learn on Adult Gohan is usually not his elbow. It is the range of his stand heavy, because his stand heavy is incredible. It can be used on reaction to many things and sets up spacings that he is very advantageous at against almost everyone in the cast. He can hit this move in response to nearly anything as well because the opponent is much less likely to approach him from the air in the first place. Goku's is equally effective when mixed up with the good Kamehameha spacing and pressure. Add their assist into this, basically covering the space in front when you don't feel confident, then you just have whatever you need. Your opponent constantly will try to get into the correct position to not have to deal with the heavy, and open themselves up for basically the entire rest of your game plan. While the move can be baited, it's actually relatively hard to bait it. With even the slightest awareness of your opponent's plans, given the speed that most moves that hit from far enough away start up, you don't really have to worry that much about it. The opponent's inability to open you up because you are then hitting things in neutral that make them uncomfortable, so it saves you a lot of stress and confusion. Having a move that actually lets you get a straight up mix up with your Dragon Rush is not something a lot of characters have available to them. And against a twitchy mix-up player who needs to get to a specific space in order to do anything in the first place, it can be effective purely because they don't have a good game plan at that situation. they're going to either try to get in and force you to block, in which case you're normally safe, or just get caught straight in your stuff.
これ以上好きにさせんぞ。逃がすか。神の力を見るがいい。
As you learn more and more of the ranges, you can bait your opponent into more and more things.
ブラック、これが俺の人間の力だ。世界もみんなの笑顔も俺が守ってみせる。
In fact, it is a common thing in games that defensive characters just have a heavy button that prevents the opponent from being able to do very much because the pushback on the heavy button is so large. Therefore, focusing your effort on learning the space in which your heavy button is effective and forcing your opponent to prove to you that they can violate that space will teach you more about the game than trying to do a lot of motion or land specials or anything else. Because once you have that solid base of knowing when you can hit heavy and your opponent having to slow down because you can hit the heavy, you get to watch the rest of the space more naturally. The overall goal will also be to help you build up a lot more meter to deal with a lot more situations than you otherwise could. This also helps you understand where your opponent tries to go after certain situations. If they try to stay away from you, it's relatively easy to actually work out when that moment of launching your long-range attack actually is. Whereas otherwise, you would have to put yourself through a lot of work to get this done. As your opponent's spacing becomes more and more obvious to you, the way to use your other moves opens up. Doing a safe move such as that one, which your opponent must then move away from, gives you time to react very easily to the action of them moving away. Good zoning characters often have a response to you attempting to backdash out, to move away in some other way. They can generally catch you in some way to make you regret the retreat. And since the player has not committed to an extremely difficult thing to do in the first place, it can be easier to Just hit the button and entirely stop thinking about it. Once you've become comfortable enough with the space for hitting the heavy, you can just hit it and then feel comfortable about your opponent's position enough to counterattack immediately if they move. Minimizing the amount of time you spend thinking about neutral by using only one button for neutral is a good way to keep yourself from getting overwhelmed by the game. A further small trick that you can see in many characters with good stand heavy is that while your opponent can attempt a punish, the pushback is usually such that when they feel as if they can, they actually have more problems than they initially thought. And since you probably had the larger control over the spacing and position at the time, your spacing is better and you have a clearer understanding of what's actually happening than they do. It is that clearer understanding that allows you to build up tactics against particular people. One of the other strengths of that form of neutral in this game, for at least opponents who don't have a lot of good attacks when they jump, is the fact that Dragon Rush is actually borderline unreactable. But most mix-up things, most defense-breaking mix-up options in fighting games are designed to be borderline unreactable. If they were too easily reactable, high-level players would never get opened up. And if they were clearly unreactable, there wouldn't be anything you could really do about them in the first place, so even anticipation would be hard. But the borderline unreactable Dragon Rush means that your opponent is more likely going to try to move out of the way. The Dragon Rush is itself a good mix-up for many characters relative to this because the stand heavy actually reaches though. So for characters whose stand heavy does reach that position, if they time it right, the opponent doesn't know which thing to deal with. This makes zoning characters stronger as well because it opens up more opportunities for them to actually do any zoning. By giving the opponent the impression that what will be coming is a stand heavy that they could then trick. And at that point, you're just going straight back to basic zoning instincts, feeling and understanding when your opponent is likely to try to approach you. In this game, having the usefulness where your stand heavy moves you forward enough to move under opponents' leaping attacks obviously helps a lot as well. Simply increasing the mental stack of your opponent by just one, making them think of literally one more thing that you could do with your time, makes their life much more difficult. So let's look at some other options that appear once you have gotten your opponent to worry about that.
The battle's about to start. Good luck.
Obviously, you gain the ability to jump. This is because most really strong anti-airs in this game require your opponent to stay still long enough to think about them. Whether or not you are jumping with the intention of actually trying to hit them, or just jumping with the intention of setting them off relative to the fact that you're doing other stuff, is up to you and your playstyle. But the basic concept of being able to use Dragon Rush, long reaching move, and usually a dashing jump at around the same space tells you a lot about how the game flows. Most other moves in these games don't tend to reach, and the opponent tends to be able to counter them all with just one thing. And they're counting on this. Nearly everything else you do will be beaten by the same single option. It actually makes fighting games relatively simple when you are not thinking as much about it, because there's so many things that you can beat with just one button. that it can be frustrating to end up facing a person who is constantly prepared and willing to just hit the same thing every time. But putting the opponent on edge by making sure to never push yourself too hard, and therefore making their single response negative to them, is also relatively required. One of the things you can easily learn is that for many characters, just blocking is the answer, and until you've given your opponent a reason to believe that they shouldn't just block, i.e. the Dragon Rush, you're basically never going to land anything. Because the sensible answer is always block and wait for you to make a mistake first. Over time, mix-up players gain more and more advantage from this because they actually have characters who have ways of opening you up. But there's another example. The uppercut basically didn't lead to anything because the likeliest situation is that the opponent was going to block. Here we have forcing the use of the Sparking Blast. Probably. Overall, therefore, if you want to figure out a way to stay closer to your opponent so that you don't have to play from full screen and hope all the time, one of the main things you must study is how to make yourself understand spacing and not flinch in neutral. Most players, regardless of their skill level, once they recognize that you tend to just do things in neutral in order to make them get hit because they were doing something, especially if they're the sort of person who has stronger options for that, they'll just wait for you all the time. And them waiting for you is your best option if you can find a move you have that changes the situation to your benefit. There is often some safe move that sets up a spacing you like, where you just get to do this for free. You can see, for example, that Gohan at a particular range can do at least 3 moves that very few opponents can do anything about without Raw Vanish. He gets to buy himself a little time against those opponents without doing anything in particular. This is the negative situation, being forced to play from full screen because of feeling underconfident in ability to approach the opponent. This happens primarily when you don't have a move that will beat theirs, but you were counting on being able to win that way. Whereas a mixed-up player is more likely to just approach and block a lot, a zoning player is more likely to try to win out somehow at advantage, even if their zoning is not likely to win. Which brings us to the understanding of when to dash, and in this game specifically how long to keep dashing. Understanding what your opponent's game plan in the neutral is, and therefore whether or not you can dash, is the next thing you have to watch for. When your character actually has a longer mid-normal or a good auto combo to bring them into space, they may not need to use their heavy. However, the moves tend to be so similar or interchangeable, depending on certain characters, that you really don't have to worry too much about it. You just figure out which one of the two is effective for the purpose and use that one. Kid Buu and Cell are both good examples of this, and it helps with their weird mix-up style pressure, one being more offensive and the other being more defensive. One other useful thing of the stand heavy is that it often leads to good corner pressure and certain types of knockdowns that are not easily attainable through other attacks. While it does not necessarily help you keep up pressure more on people who are aware of it, it does have more variable forms of pressure after it. It's a good way to save yourself from having to do a lot of pressure that may not work in the mid-range. Another good place you can see this is when your opponent is actually recovering from a close range attack, but you don't know whether or not you get pressure. In the mid-screen, this is usually a good time to hit the stand heavy because your opponent will be bounced into the air still and land on it at the end, meaning that they mostly can't do anything to you. This is one of the few spacings and timings in which Kid Boo's and Cell's attacks do not help as much. Low sliding or long range medium attacks are less effective when the opponent is recovering off the ground because they tend to miss with the hitbox. Therefore, it is in your best interest to stick with your stand heavy attack when your opponent is recovering in a way that you don't feel familiar with, because usually the worst that will happen is that they will get into a scramble, and in that scramble they will manage to hurt themselves very slightly. Or hurt you very slightly, but not much. An opponent who is then shut down by the fact that they need to try to get through your movement with your stand heavy or your sliding medium, low, or even your auto combo, depending, then has to try to use more resources and mental effort to get close in other ways, which are also more defensible, whereas the stand heavy is not so much trying to defend correctly as it is taking advantage of the strength of a particular button in neutral. Your opponents need to get past that button, however, can lead them to take less safe approach vectors. More importantly, thinking about the match in that way means that you're more likely to feel comfortable when your opponent is retreating and not worry so much about trying to close the distance quickly, because you won't necessarily think of your goal in the match as getting to them to do more damage, but rather seeing where you can place yourself to get your stand heavy or other zoning tools. It enables you to spend much more time watching where your opponent is on the screen rather than trying to move immediately and focusing on doing another attack. This is helpful in a game where we already have a large number of things to track, and therefore figuring out exactly what it is that your opponent is doing takes even more mental effort. As you can see, Kid Boo's stand heavy is actually not as powerful as the others. It has much shorter range, but this is made up for by his stand medium. The downside of his stand medium is that he's likely to move himself forward and be less safe than most other characters using their stand heavy attack. Vegeta, on the other hand, has both options in his blue form. He has both a decent stand heavy and a good grounded auto combo to push in as if he was using one. This gives him, in both of his forms, honestly, a fairly good mix-up with his Dragon Rush, as long as he's reasonably sure that the opponent is either about to move or staying still. Note that just like any other action in this game, you can't really use this just hitting the button as soon as you are capable of it, because at that point it's just a scramble slash panic situation and you can't predict what will happen. You need to spend more time looking at where exactly your opponent is and whether or not it's a good idea to do this. Part of the reason this is so effective is that many opponents, when they realize that the range is too large for you to hit with anything else, are willing to go for slower moves. This is particularly effective in the corner where there's nowhere for them to go back to. Their slower moves may stop your Dragon Rush, but they're often not effective against stand heavy. One good example here is that Beerus continues to move through the air at spaces where Vegeta could easily catch him with the stand heavy as he's coming back down, while being at very little risk of anything Beerus actually does. The feeling that the opponent is out of reach and therefore you should not take any actions is generally a way to lose in games like this, because the opponent managing to stay out of your reach is not necessarily that difficult to keep up. A good opponent, after a certain amount of pressure, has a clear idea of where they want to be to prevent you from counterattacking them immediately, i.e. to make you miss if you respond to the end of their pressure by taking immediate action. But you don't have to take immediate action. Most of the time you need to think about where they are going to be soon and aim your attack at that spot. So make sure to experiment at least somewhat with the idea that your opponent's movement is not actually so good at escaping you if you find the right attack to do it. The right attack is very seldom your special attack, because if it was your special attack, they probably wouldn't be trying to escape in that direction. Your opponent is thinking about where your specials hit and trying to not be there. But you can always use your normals to remind them, hey, I cover more space on the screen than that. I can, in fact, hit you. I just can't hit you with my specials. Obviously, this style of play also makes it harder for you to focus on what we were talking about last week, though. You're much less likely to use your assist to cover your space or think about how best to utilize your meter if you're worried about playing neutral. This is another good reason why, if you're building up bit by bit, it's easiest to start with just one button because it prevents you from having to worry about a lot of other aspects of the conversions, game plans, and so on. Then you can put your mental effort into just one thing, leaving all the slots you had before, such as help with assists, when to wake up sparking, and all those things, as a natural part of your flow. Always remember that offensive characters have the smallest mental stack by nature. And this is often the reason that they feel so much more powerful, especially in the early versions of game matchups. It can be in fact fairly disappointing and stressful for those players when they get to the higher levels and other players have already gotten past that part of the mental stack and can just counter them all the time. So now we're going to see the third adult Gohan matchup versus the blue team.
Brace yourself for the coming battle.
This team is actually much less likely to get caught or dealt with purely by the stand heavy, but this is only true because they tend to move into the air, and as noted before, Gohan's attacks toward the air aren't that great. The reason it's important in this matchup is because the assists on this team also don't attack the air all that well. This would not have come up before because the assist would either have covered the person coming down, or the style didn't really require it. In this case though, how does one catch a jumping opponent with these characters, despite not being able to easily use the stand heavy against them? The key is in the fact that to jump back, there's a timing at which you end up vulnerable in the air. It's not a very complex timing either. If you note when the opponent goes into the air, there's a spot where they kind of float there. And while it is kind of difficult with adult Gohan because his tracking on the elbow is relatively bad, the EX1 does a good job. So the opponent jumps back, and Gohan can basically react with elbow and catch them before they get to do anything. As you can see, the timing is specific. You have to be ready for that jump back fairly early. You have to understand the spacing at which the jump back slows down and Gohan's tracking kicks back in, and you get to do things. But once you have that down, the keep away style that your opponent is playing becomes impossible to keep up. Trunks similarly has some forward attacks that deal with that situation. He just has to stay a little closer than Gohan does, but Trunks does that anyway. But by far the most effective person on this team with dealing with that is actually Krillin. Krillin's after image attack can reach really far. And Krillin can also use a hopping Kamehameha, which can be started and then done at a different timing altogether. So you can change whether or not he's even attacking you towards the ground. Good timing with this will allow you to change whether or not Krillin's approach is safe and whether or not the opponent can do basically anything. In the worst case, he's stuck using his regular Ki Blast, which comes back down at a spacing and timing that the opponent still can't do much about, forcing them to shift their playstyle to where he can safely approach them and use his other options. Once the opponent is opened up by this consistent movement and no longer feels as comfortable jumping away, it's a lot easier for this type of character to get their spacing back. But as you see here, or saw a moment ago, just attacking immediately after the opponent has done something on the ground often means that the type of attack you are doing is aimed at them staying where they were. This is extremely unlikely when your characters have good push out, like Vegeta and Goku do, so you should generally be expecting your opponent to push themselves out but not continue their pressure, and therefore you should just wait a little bit longer rather than trying to immediately counterattack. They're just going to block that anyway. Messing up your own rhythm in these ways can lead to you losing in very frustrating methods from your opponent's side. Therefore, you should do your best after characters who have long push-out block strings finish those block strings to recognize what evasive or tracking moves you have to move forward and delay those moves very slightly until your opponent has shown you that they're not going to just get out of the way. Immediately counterattacking, especially with characters who don't have good, safe auto combo strings, will lead to you getting squashed because you will end up back close where those characters want to be, namely your opponent's characters, and have no real options anymore. Even your mix-ups are less likely to work because your opponent had control of the space. They know exactly what space they left you at, and therefore they also know whether or not your mix-up is valid. This is a super important part of games like this in general, especially games where the player doesn't have a whole lot of moves for any given character. So there we see Beerus ending up with advantage because of the immediate counterattack after a Beerus attack string. It forces back to neutral at best, where the character has advantage naturally. And since most options would have missed regardless, there's not really much you get. But of course, since you can't respond to the middle of the block string either, it is absolutely an exercise in patience once you find yourself having to block, to not only finish blocking, but to wait a little bit after the blocking to figure out what to do next. This aspect alone can take hours of training just to get through. You can somewhat see the scrambly response here of basically, as soon as one recovers, do another move. But this results in an extremely low accuracy, one that most of us wouldn't even accept in any other game we play. Fighting games are so fast-paced though that it often feels as if having low accuracy is less of a problem than not taking your turn often enough. It is more scary to let your opponent's turn continue than it is to throw out random attacks that whiff entirely, at least until you get a bit higher. So obviously today the team is going to be trying to put a lot more effort into making sure that they are not twitching. That is the next level we mostly need in order to level up. Understanding your moves, that's gotten us fairly far so far. understanding attack vectors and meter usage even more so. But truly capitalizing on your opportunities requires you to identify more and more opportunities as you go on. In the end, that is the thing that will always hold players back from getting to what we consider high skill levels. Because understanding how to use your opportunities does not matter if you never get them. Therefore, you must expand your repertoire of opportunities you understand so that you can get more damage and more time to play the game. The concept of what your turn is needs to adapt enough that you can identify it. Or you will end up getting rushed down by players who have either better understanding of their opportunities or just characters who are better at setting up opportunities. The neutral game of Dragon Ball Fighter is because it has so many spaces on the screen you could attack. But unlike Marvel, it lacks the sheer amount of potential vectors of attack per character, that is. Means that paying attention to these opportunities and converting in neutral takes a lot more awareness than effort. Working hard is very good, but working hard to perfect your combos and similar responses to strong opportunities is not going to help you if you don't get them. I don't have to pretend that we can just kill everyone in the audience. So when you're playing, ask yourself above all else, what is an opportunity? When did I actually take an action because I saw it was my chance? And when did I take an action because I was really hoping it would work? Because really hoping it would work is only ever going to take you so far. This isn't to discourage random action, but rather that the goal of your random action should be less hitting your opponent and more so seeing if it would work. Mentally, therefore, you should be able to take stock of when an idea has worked out well and do your best not to repeat ideas that don't. Or at least if you do repeat them, try to make sure that the situation is different. So let's consider what Kid Buu has as an option. Well, he can also do aerial beam attacks. And he has the additional aspect of being able to do both his medium in the air and basically the Buu ball to come back down if the opponent decided to move in. Gohan, on the other hand, can really only do one thing towards air attacks, making it much more difficult for him to deal with this team. He has many less opportunities than Kid Buu does. Having less opportunities leads you to be more defensive and a little bit more stressed out in neutral, leading to the opponent opening you up more often. But the important thing is that the opportunity only arises if you wait long enough for it to appear. Here's a good example of the opportunity for the stand heavy. It doesn't come up that often because the opponent has to want to move forward first, but you have opportunities that come up because you've made them want to move forward. More importantly, as shown here, when you force your opponent to take advantage of suboptimal opportunities on their own side, the amount of damage they get for the amount of effort they put into that damage is usually much smaller. You can simply gain larger advantage more often than them, especially in a game like this where there's a lot of time spent recovering health and similar things. As you can see, that exchange eventually came out in Kid Buu's favor, even though there was a lot of blocking. There was no specific need to take more actions right then. This also allows you to understand your opponent's mindsets better by spending more time watching what they do after certain other actions. Something that you will nearly never get on your own if you just keep on hitting buttons, because you're more likely watching to see whether or not your button hit and confirming. So we're about the halfway point of our stream, so I'm going to be talking a bit less to give the team a bit more time to focus on actually watching for those opportunities. Now that I've done enough lecturing on which buttons and so on can be used to open up or search for those opportunities without stressing yourself too much mentally. If you find that you're doing too many specials, substitute stand heavy somewhere. If you find your opponent is jumping too much, wait a little bit and try to attack the airspace if you have the character with that capacity. And if you think they're on defense, just Dragon Rush them.
さあ願いを言え。
蹴らしてくれ。ノータスそうだ逃がさないぞ。なんだクリリン大丈夫か。
That match actually showed one of the other mentioned things. Knowing how far to dash
今すぐに
is important, and knowing how far you will dash if you just do it naturally. Is equally important. How far do you dash if you just double tap the button as you do in any other fighting game? Does it differ by character, for example? And do you have enough of recovery after it that your opponent can punish you for doing the shortest possible dash?
Gohan-san, Super Saiyajin じゃないのになんてパワーだ。
来ないのか。ならこっちから行くぞ。
やるな。
まだまだ。相手だ。修行の成果を見せてやる。オラが相手だ。なんだ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。俺に指図するな。どうだ。調子に乗るな。逃がさば神の力を見るがいい。受けるがいい。我が刃いっぱい飛ばすぞ。さあ行くぞ。捉えた。どうだ。修行の成果を見せてやる。行くぞ。逃がさば神の力を見るがいい。参った全力で行くぞ。約束しろ。行くぞ。まだまだ。またよっしゃ。どっか。
なんて力だ。まだいける。悟空さん、俺の修行の成果。
Being able to figure out where your opponent is going to be in versus style games is a skill you have to build up over usually months of practice. In some games where the opponent can be knocked into the air but your own character can only move at a certain speed, it's easier to do this. Fortunately for us, Dragon Ball FighterZ offers us a simple solution to this, in that once you are relatively certain that your opponent is in approximately the same place and isn't moving too quickly from that spot, even if you can't reach it with any other move, you can just hit your vanish button, assuming you have meter, and you will go directly to them. This is actually more useful in the air because it's harder to punish vanishes that land on aerial opponents. Of course, this is also less damaging than you could otherwise use your meter for, but a lot of the time, just feeling comfortable enough because of knowing that your opponent is in that space and that you can hit them if you need to helps a lot.
調子に乗るな。点数をつけるとすれば目玉だ。調子に乗るな。まだまだ。調子に乗るな。
This brings us back to the point mentioned in much of our other recent content, even for other games. Whether or not you win or lose against characters has often a lot more to do with their rhythm naturally than anything to do with direct skill application. It is a reproducible event. Two characters do approximately the same thing in some part of the match, make contact with each other, and they fly off in different directions. They both immediately try to do another move, because neither of them specifically got knocked down, for example, although one of them could, even if they could recover quickly enough. And they both usually just choose to do the most powerful move that could hit the opponent from that far away. And no matter how many times you do this, one of those moves tends to win over the other. It's therefore very important to recognize when you're the one in that losing situation, so that you can make sure that you're not overdoing it and reacting too fast, when the only result of you reacting too fast is that your opponent gets to keep on having the same reaction themselves.
今のうちに下がるんだ。神の力を見るがいい。神の力を見せてやる。終わりだ。逃がさん行くぞ。捕らえた。さあどうだ。その着物は今夜は心地よい眠りにつけさ。調子に乗るな。神の怒りを味わえ。
神にあらがう罪人が。
神の力を見るがいい。どうした。受けるがいい。
Many of us further suffer from the fact that when you actually do these things normally and are successful, if you're on the winning end of that little exchange, it's easy to get the idea that the move you're doing is a good idea and that you should therefore try to move as soon as possible all the time. It gets you into a mindset, a state of mind where it is easy to keep repeating things based on, I vanished, therefore I'm immediately doing this other move. And similar, where you're basically holding on to nothing in particular. You just want to do your next move so that your opponent can't get to do theirs. It won't necessarily lead you very far, but it won't necessarily break what you're doing either. And the fact that it doesn't can actually be worse for you in the long term. Because eventually someone will come along who can break it. And at that point, the effort it will take to train your autopilot to stop doing it will be much higher.
じゃねえぞ。まだまだ。
これから見せるのが本当の力だ。おっと、この攻撃いけた。やばいですよ。そこまでだ。おっと、やってみせる。
俺がやってやら。
消えろ。
叫んじゃねえぞ。
黙れ。バーニングランコ。遅いぞ。黙れ。
まあまあだな。油断してた。叫んじゃねえぞ。
この攻撃から見せた。さあ、いよいよ俺の出番だ。とっておきだ。はいや、やってやる。はい、とー。ビトラトレヤキラ。終わらせてやる。バーニングランコ。
One of the strengths of the team you just saw is that they don't need to use meter to get away from very much. Frieza, Yamcha, and Bardock are all capable of putting space between them and the opponent quickly enough to lure the opponent into trying to keep up. And they all have good moves for attacking in the vector back down that the opponent is most likely to be taking up when they do this. Most other teams would need to use assists to get this done cleanly, but this trio can generally manage on their own, leaving them free to use their assists in offensive situations only and keep up the pressure when they choose to. Combine that with the escape, and they are able to use assists to keep the opponent quiet so that they can get away again, counterattack if the opponent tries to pursue them, and just wait for the assist to recharge. Eventually, somewhere in there, you're going to get opened up.
Get ready. Go.
まあまあだな。
そこまでだ。
なめんじゃねえ。タッチだ。分かってこい。そらそらそらどうしたうい。この程度か。なめんじゃねえ。どうした。まあまあだな。焦ってきやがれ。焦って。
こう見えても僕は優しいんだ。 おっと、いや、なんですって。もう許さん。ちょっと本気を出しますよ。さらなる進化を求めて正解でしたよ。できますよ。後悔しますよ。おっと、どうだ。その調子、ここですよ。おっと、死になさい。ここですよ。貴様の相手はこの僕だ。敵は俺が撃ってやる。ここをお願いします。どうした。点数をつけるとすればビッグバンアタック。ダメ。ちょっと待った。どうした。まずいな。こいつはハンデだ。こっちだぜ。こんなものか。なめるなよ。なめしまったらちゃんとは引っ込んでろ。俺を信じろ。油断してたぜ。ふざけんじゃねえぞ。そこだ。点数をつけると遅いぜ。ここを見ている。ビッグバンアタック。やろう。なめんじゃねえ。これするい。なめんじゃねえ。よくもコケにしてくれたな。未来は俺が変えてみせる。どういう風の吹き回しだ。何を企んでやがる。フリーザー。 The battle's about to start. Good luck! Are you ready? Fight it out!
どうした？はっはっちだ。行くぞ。トンタッチだ。いい加減。俺が直々に相手をしてやる。許さんぞ。
次は助けんからな。
かんな。
調子に乗るな。ビッグバック。
調子に乗るな。
ファイナルステージ。これで終わりだ。
この俺を超えてみろ。簡単には超えさせないがな。
It's time to face your opponent. Ready? Fight! その調子。
大丈夫ですか？
その程度ですか？後悔しますよ。
俺を信じろ。どうした？よくもこけにしてくれたな。そら。
これ以上好きにさせろ。
まあまあだな。
交代できますか？
チカどうだ？見えてるぞ。せい。大丈夫ですか？やるな。終わりにしてやる。どうした？大丈夫か？見えてるぞ。どうした？無駄だ。無駄だ。そんな。お願いします。まだまだ。よっ。本気でいくぞ。終わらせてやる。無駄です。見えてるぞ。
今度はこっちからやらせてもらうよ。
なるほど。
ちょっと脅してみなさい。ここですよ。今度はシェイカー宇宙の塵にしてやる。なんなかなか
どうだいっぱい飛ばすぞ。
なんですって。
修行の成果を見せてやる。
大丈夫ですか。おお、なるほど。これでどうだ。その調子で生きた。
俺がやってやら。
遅いぜ。
なめんじゃねえ。そこか。どうした。よくもコケにしてやる。どうした。間に合って。なめんじゃねえ。
遅いぜ。
そんなもんかよ。そら何口にするんだ。叫んじゃねえぞ。なめんじゃねえ。終わりじゃねえぞ。かかってこい。
よくもコケにしてくれたな。
なんのそら残像だ。どうだ残像だ。そっちだ。よっとなんの手配してくれ。よっ
油断してたぜ。
くそそうだ。戦いの感が鈍ってるな。これが今の僕の全力です。
Now, as mentioned earlier in the stream, we are back to seeing Cell in action, along with Vegeta on top of that. The missing component is of course Android 16, but Nappa will do at least in terms of mobility and letting you see where the character needs to be on the screen and why. These characters all have very long chains, but more importantly, they have more opportunities than most. So let's look for this.
なたには厳しい戦いになるでしょう。ちょっと脅してやるか。おっ、ここですよ。
脅かしやがって。
すぐに終わらせてやる。
砕け注意。
その調子。なかなか。死になさい。ちょっと脅してここですよ。今度は死ぬかもね。しまった。
地球ごと消えてなくなれ。
せいぜい楽しませてくれよ。
遅い。
これで終わりです。
よくもコケにしてくれたな。
すぐに終わらせてやる。
油断してたぜ。
無駄だ。防げまい。さて、くらえ。くらえ。カメファミリーハッ。防げまい。この私にバリアが
お前なんか僕がやっつけてやる。見えてるぞ。無駄だ。
くらえ。スピードには自信がある。この程度か。どうしたこだろ。
無駄だ。
キロリア。
見えてるぞ。
動け動け。無駄だ。
見えてるぞ。
貴様。
せい。
貴様ごときに。
無駄だ。
さあ、楽しませてもら
許さないぞ。どうだ。これで終わりにしてやる。
地球ごと消えてなくなれ。防げまい。砕け中。この私にバリアを張らせると。
Another reason why Cell is considered to be so strong, as you can see, is that he is very capable of wearing down opponents who are exhausted due to lack of meter and who are low on life and can't afford to take too many chances. Cell puts himself in a lot of spaces where without meter it's very difficult to do a lot of damage to him. The result is that over time you have about the same amount of interactions with anyone else as with Cell. But the damage you get off those interactions against Cell is so much lower, and Cell manages to continually clip you, whereas other characters tend to be trying to convert into big damage and use up their meter. Cell is usually fighting by doing a lot of small damage and controlling your position on the screen much better. Other characters who are generally good at this are Frieza and Piccolo, but Frieza tends to be spending more time trying to get out of the way, and Piccolo tends to be spending more time specifically putting you in positions, which once you use enough meter, you could get out of them, and you'd eventually build up the meter to do it as a result of the other interactions. Cell is the best at preventing you from gaining any meter, and as a result keeps that disparity.
ベジータ様を失望させるなよ。行きますよ。
人は暴れて殺せるぜ。
やるな。交代できますか。
どうだ。なんだ。
さてと
いっぱい飛ばすぞ。
さて
逃がさないぞ。どうだ。
全体このクソガキが
置けばかろう。
どうだ。逃がさないぞ。修行の成果を見せてやる。見えた。
せいぜい楽しませてくれよ。
そこまかと
なんだ。
無駄だ。スタバっちまえ。こいつの挨拶代わり。
In that match, you saw the relative effectiveness of the standing heavy attack in terms of how much the damage from it scales relative to things like Vanish or other clipping attacks. The standing heavy is so low scaling that you can do probably 25% health on most characters without actually doing any specials. Just do the stand heavy into the off-the-wall auto combo and it will probably do a good chunk of damage even to characters who are low on health. While this is not a way to open people up, of course, being able to catch them because of oddness in their positioning can finish off people that you would expect to need supers to beat. And given the way that most of the startup of the super moves in this game go, if you were really expecting your opponent to come at you, the amount of invincibility on most of them means that you might as well just have hit the stand heavy and hoped for the best that way. At least then you would not have cost yourself a massive amount of meter. The time this is not true is when you expect your opponent to dash in and Z change, in which case the super is better at that point.
対に許さんぞ。僕が石だ。そうだ、見えてるぞ。
さて無駄だ。
邪魔だ。
どうした。そうだ。
仕方がありませんね。
見えてるぞ。
調子に乗りやがって。
You'll note that the same thing is seen when there is only one hit before the stand heavy, although many moves may cause the wall bounce to disappear if that is the case.
遅いぜ。
仕方がありませんね。
一匹残らず言い返しては返さんぞ。いますよ。ここですよ。
セルがいい。
絶対に許すぞ。
人暴れしてきて
みんなちょっと脅してここですよ。分かった。宇宙の塵にしてやる。おっと安っぽいネーミングですが、ゴールデンフリーザとでも言っておきましょうか。虫けらが。
覚悟しろ。
ここですよ。俺が負けるか。見なさい。
吹っ飛べ。
いますよ。
すぐに終わらせてやる。
おっと。
カメハメハさっカメハメハだ
どうした。ここですよ。ここですよ。
どうして
その手
カメハメハ
おっと。
さっ
俺が負けるか。虫けらが。おっと。おっと。なるほど。見なさい。見なさい。ここですよ。さあ、そのまま命のような。
Frieza's command normals also have similar scaling or proration as it is called in some games. And therefore, you don't have to worry about it necessarily being only that. Crouch heavy moves have slightly different scaling, at least that's what I've been able to find in my research, but it's not clear exactly why, and whether or not it does this only when you are using them as anti-airs, or if it's about the same when you clip them off the ground. But do remember it whenever you do have the option to hit with such moves, because you don't have to work as hard to get the damage off them. So you can maximize your returns for being aware of the situation enough to use it instead of autopiloting with a medium or similar.
トランクス、私をがっかりさせないでくれ。
Get ready. Fight it out. Counter.
しゃ許さんぞ。行くぞ。まだまだ。えいよ。本気で行くぞ。行くぞ。ただ足にならん。許さんぞ。よっ。
せいぜい楽しませてくれよ。
よっしゃ。こっか。よっ。おて兄ちゃん。行くぞ。まだまだ。
動け動け。
許さんぞ。
下ろせるぜ。邪魔だ邪魔だ。
よっ。
雨ごときに。
そう楽しませてもらおう。
砕け注意。
そろそろ殺してしまう。
砕け注意。
どうした。
だなんだと。だ地球ごと消えてなくなれ。
この手許さんぞ。ここをお願いします。これ以上好きにさせんぞ。お前はもう終わりだ。完全に消え去ってしまえ。
さて
誤算だったな。敵だって成長するんだ。俺も気を抜いていられないな。
The battle's about to start. Good luck! It's all or nothing. Fight!
スピードには自信がある。
なかなかちょっと脅してやるか。その調子。ちょっと脅してなるほど。死になさい。その程度ですか。出
さて
遅いぞ。
やれやれ。その程度です。しますよ。しますよ。どうだい。死になさい。かかったのに今すぐ黙らせてやるぞ。ちょっと脅してやるか。
いいだろ。
私にバリーを
卒業。
俺がやってやら。
バカめ。
僕が
このナッパ様にかなうわけがないんだ。ナッパウィン。スーパーサイヤ人ベジータの野郎見せつけやがって。
Dragon Ball Rumble! It's all or nothing! Let's go!
ますよ。ちょっと脅きでやってみなさい。うわここですよ。僕も勝てる。行きますよ。そこか。せい、いいぞ。やるな。大丈夫ですか？どうした？そら。なめんじゃねえ。これから見せるのが本当の力だ。絶対逃げるさ。やるな。そら。無駄です。そんな。見えた。逃がさないぞ。どうだ。どうだ。無駄です。見えた。せい。逃がさないぞ。どうだ。敵は俺が撃ってやる。任せてください。なんですって。さらなる進化を求めて正解でしたよ。死になさい。なんですって。なんですって。どうだ。これでどうだ。俺に殺された。この攻撃だ。この攻撃ですって。行くぞ。ここで相手だ。どうだ。俺がやってやら。そら。どうした。よっ。どうだ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。叫んじゃねえぞ。そら。よっ。遅いぞ。こんなもんかよ。見えた。死なんの。絶対終わりじゃねえか。そら。しまった。そら。なめんじゃねえ。治療の成果を見せてやる。遅いぞ。
In that match, you could easily see how important both spacing and the ability to break your opponent's expectations turned out to be. Make sure that whenever you have a game plan in mind, that you understand what your opponent will start to expect as it becomes more and more successful, and be ready to break that expectation in some way, even if it's not a way that you're absolutely certain will work. Because the only way to make sure that you don't lose in that situation is to use something that can't be punished in any way, which is not usually all that available to you.
Get ready for battle! Are you ready? Go! Counter!
どうだい。なるほど。虫けらが。どうだい。ちょっと見なさい。おっと。その程度
ですか。来なさい。
動きは何だと。
ライキザキ。いますよ。ここですよ。今度はシルカもうここまでだ。もういますよ。ちょっと脅してやるか。来なさい。いますよ。ちょっと脅してみなさい。今度はシルカもうここまでだ。おっとどうだい。甘いですよ。虫けらがなかなか。
さて
ちょっと本気を出しますよ。
カメハメハ。
安っぽいネーミングですが、ゴールデンフリーザとでも言っておきましょうか。ちょっと脅してやるか。ちょっと脅してやるか。どうだい。ちょっと脅してやるか。おっと虫けらがここですよ。
なんだ
ちょっと脅していますよ。ちょっと脅してやる。ここですよ。
この程
甘いです。
度。さて防げまい砕けじゅさす無駄だ。防げまい砕けじゅ。この私にバリアをかわせんと。
俺が撃ってやる。
そろそろ殺してしまうか。
なんだと。
さて防げまい砕けじゅ。
まあまあだな。
さて防げまい砕けじゅ。無駄だ。
まあまあですか。言うのはてめえだ。どうした。遅いぜ。
動け動け。
やめんじゃね
さてカメハメこの程度。この私にバリアをかわせんと。無駄だ。
見えてる止めなきゃそんな。
防げまい砕けじな。無駄だ。
無駄だ。
この私せいぜい楽しませてくれよ。無駄だ。笑わせるぞ。
させやがって。これにこれでもう二度と悪いことはしないんだな。
Now as we get closer to the end of stream, it's time for us to go all out and see what we can manage to keep up while actually doing everything and see what we can add in from this training session. So you can expect the remaining 2 to 3 matches to be no holds barred as we close out Kame House lobbies for today. And there we have the usual amount of crazy intensity that Dragon Ball FighterZ is known for. Looks like we're going to get 2 more matches before we close up. Do remember that we are here every week at the same time, and therefore you can join in if you desire to. For those watching on YouTube later, the loser stays on East Coast lobby.
It's all or nothing. Fight!
虫けらちょっと脅きで死になさい。なかなか受けてみろ。虫けらがいますよ。ここですよ。かかったよ。この手でよし、なんだぞ。次も砕け散れ。叫んじゃねえぞ。そんなもんかよ。邪魔だ。遅いぜ。どうした。そんなもんかよ。
仕方がありません。
やめんじゃな。なぜだ。
油断してたぜ。
くだらん技だ。無駄だ。無駄だ。
仕方がありません。遅いぜ。こんなもんかよ。
かかってこい。なめんじゃねえぞ。
仕方がありません。油断してたぜ。よくもここにしてくれたな。遅いぜ。どうした。
この程度か。
仕方がありませんね。
終わりじゃねえぞ。
全体のこの私は名門でのエリートだ。
見えてるぞ。
俺様が
Another high-intensity match with a lot of blocking.
ありがとうございました。
Then again, that is probably the best thing you can do in certain situations in this game. Learn to block, everyone. It's very important. But now, tonight's final match of the stream. Do stop by tomorrow for some general stream of consciousness stuff in Street Fighter V. This guidance, yes, but not necessarily directly resulting in a full kata or bot creation. Stop by next week, Monday around the same time for Street Fighter V lounge content, and Tuesday for Guilty Gear. Wednesday is likely to be another open mic, but it could be Sandai Casuals, and of course, next week Thursday, once again, Kame House lobbies.
地獄のような未来はもうたくさんだ。
この程度か。無駄だ。ここは譲ってやろう。
やるな。そっちか。
無駄だ。
僕も覚悟します。
動け動け。フォローせるぜ。
このままでは
相手だ。
さっさと来い。
見えた。はい、飛ばすぞ。
邪魔だ。無駄だ。
どうだ。
貴様。
どうだ。
無駄だ。
逃がさないぞ。
踊れ。
行くぞ。捕らえた。どうだ。
ごときに。すぐに終わらせてやる。
修行の 成果を見せてやる。行くぞ。捕らえた。どうだ。
遅い。
まだまだ。許さんぞ。行くぞ。まだまだ。よっよっ。
ガラキだ。
許さんぞ。
行くぞ。このベジータ様を失望させるなよ。調子に乗り上がって
その手せい。
足にならん。覚悟しろ。ガラキ足にならん。
よっえりゃういふっ
手触りだ。
くそ俺が相手だ。
セルがいい。
まだまだ。ここだ。どうだ。よっこいつだ。
ガラキだ。
And it's Krillin with the closeout today.
なんとか生きてるな。
This has been Rillian
ちょっとは
for
様になったかな。
Team 2MK. Enjoy your night, everyone.